Good morning, everybody. As Brian mentioned, we're going to be digging a little bit deeper into ride-sharing and car-sharing. Now, you've probably heard a lot about how ride-sharing and car-sharing are going to be disrupting the industry. In fact, you're probably a little bit sick of hearing about it. But today we're going to focus on how electrification in particular is going to impact ride-sharing. Obviously, electric cars have a lot of advantages, but they also have a lot of challenges, particularly in this environment that we're going to be talking about today. So we have a great panel of experts that we're going to be using to fill up these amazing chairs. Joining me today is going to be Akshay Jaising, Director of Operations at Maven. David Liniado is VP of Consumer Mobility at Cox Automotive. Aarjav Trivedi is founder and CEO of Ridecell. And Alex Thibault is GM North America of Vulog. Come on up, guys. Hello again. Have a seat. Howdy.
All right. I'll jump on the end. It's fine.
Hi. All right, I'll sit in the middle.
Great.
These are really some of the best chairs I've ever seen. I think I need to get one of these in my office. All right, Akshay, at Maven, you've already got some EVs on the road as part of your fleet. Let's start at the real high level. Let's kind of define things, and then we'll dig a little bit deeper later on. But to start, what are some of the key advantages of an EV, as we're talking about, in this kind of ride-sharing perspective?
Sure. So at Maven, we've already deployed 250 Chevrolet Bolt EVs in ride-sharing, and the main motivation was obviously zero emissions. Along with that, we are trying to solve this chicken and egg problem, right? So we all believe in an electric future, but there's limited infrastructure today. So by deploying Bolt EVs in a high mileage use case in ride sharing, we are creating that demand for charging. So it's helping companies build out that infrastructure as well. In terms of fleet management, we clearly see a big advantage from lower downtime because these cars require less maintenance, like an EV doesn't require an oil change, as an example. On the flip side, obviously, drivers who are driving this car day in and day out in a high mileage environment like ride sharing need to cater for charging. What's worked out really well is, with the Bolt has 238 miles of range, and with the DC fast charging infrastructure, in about an hour you get 150 miles. So it's kind of working out pretty well.
And David, what are some of the potential disadvantages here, particularly as we're talking about increased utilization in an EV versus something like an internal combustion car?
Well, one of the big things we're seeing at Cox Automotive is the wholesale marketplace is the data and the residual value of EVs. We're seeing quite a drop versus combustion engine vehicles. And with that, I think the opportunity for EVs really skyrockets when you think about sharing and subscription models, similar to, we launched a Flex Drive model within our company where you can subscribe to the car. I think when the consumer no longer worries about the residual pricing, the longevity of the battery, all of the things that are anxiety points, I think we start to really hit that inflection point.
And is it just the rate of progress that's really driving that depreciation at this point? Or why is it really causing these cars to depreciate so quickly?
I think a lot of it is, one is the tax issues, so we've seen that. You saw that in the state of Georgia, dramatically drop off. The other is just the propensity for people to lease versus purchase. And then once those leases give up, they go into the wholesale marketplace. So we're really seeing the data that we have that the resale value of EVs is really dropping dramatically, which everybody's seen in the marketplace. I think consumer education is probably the biggest point that we've got to contend with.
Before we get too deep, we've got a poll that I wanted to throw out there so that you guys can start getting your votes in. The question is pretty simple. Do you think EVs will help or hinder the car and ride-sharing perspective? Your options are, will they help? Will they be a hindrance? Or will they have no impact at all? We'll have the number coming up here for you in just a moment. You can text in your responses, let us know what you think, and then at the end of our discussion here in about 20 minutes' time, we'll let you know what you said. All right, so Alex, from an infrastructure standpoint, what kind of changes are needed to facilitate having more electrification in a ride/car sharing perspective?
Sure. I think there's two angles that you can take this question from. There's an angle from a city standpoint, and there's an angle from a private charging infrastructure, right? Some cities will offer incentives in order for companies to come in with car share, ride hailing, ride sharing, because they don't have charging infrastructure. There's going to be costs involved in setting up that infrastructure. You're going to need to set up charging stations, maybe depots, even in some areas where cars would need to be bring to be charged faster. And cities need to react to that. So cities need to offer incentives like free parking or any other which way that they can do in order for companies to be able to sustain coming in and taking charge of that infrastructure. The flip side of it, the possibility is that the city would say, okay, well, we're going to invest big. We're going to invest in the charging infrastructure. This is the way of the future anyway, so this is going to need to happen somewhere down the road, and then the city can take care of that and then maybe charge a little bit more on parking for a free-floating car share operation, and then they will make some revenue out of that, and then things balance out in the end. But the infrastructure obviously is key, but there's no one model that'll fit everyone. Every single city around the world will have a different incentive structure, and they will have a different infrastructure in place for these services to be put in place.
Aarjav, is that something you really expect for municipalities to help on? Because right now, we haven't really seen a lot of cities diving in headfirst with ride sharing. In fact, we've seen a lot of cases where the cities are actually trying to put the brakes on this stuff.
Yeah, so I would distinguish the problems that specific ride-sharing companies have had from car sharing or mobility in general. As an example, Madrid now has multiple car sharing services. Madrid requires them to be all electric. And in reality, when you look at the kind of utilization these services have and that we expect from them, imagine those many miles in a city happening on a combustion engine versus an electric car, right? That's the city's reason to. Yeah. But I'll add one more thing to Alex's answer. We typically don't think of software as infrastructure. But let's face it, we are not going to have perfect charger sort of frequency or density in the next couple of years. And it's still going to be important for a number of reasons to have electric vehicles, some of which we discussed. And so it's important to think of software as an infrastructure, right? Both car sharing and ride sharing have these huge peak times that are pretty far apart. Typically, on Mondays morning and evening or Friday evening, and you have ample time in the middle to be able to do these active fleet management type things. What's important is that the software you use has the ability to automatically manage that workflow, to automatically dispatch and use the right routing and machine learning to be able to get these cars to the chargers at the right time. And that's where I see a lot of the initial pioneers sort of struggling a little bit, because it's not either or. You really need both, and as infrastructure improves, your utilization will improve.
And as a provider of some of those software solutions, what kind of learnings have you picked up this far along when it comes to managing an EV fleet particularly versus just a traditional fleet?
Yeah, so here's a great example, right? We're still probably the only provider that allows you to have one large fleet of vehicles that are simultaneously available on multiple models. So on Ridecell, you can have 1,000 cars in a city. They're simultaneously available for sharing, for daily rentals and hourly rentals, and by the minute free floating. Now, someone who's renting a free floating car sharing car will only drive for 10 minutes. So you can leave a car on that free floating service all the way up until it has 10% charge. You can squeeze that last charge out of it. But if you're renting a car to a ride sharing driver, you really need it to have closer to 100% battery, right? And so the intelligent management of where a particular car is available is a pretty critical piece, and that's one of the maybe non-obvious things that we have seen and been able to execute on.
Actually, talking about bringing these EVs to market into the fleet, what's the impact of the design of these cars on car sharing and ride sharing? Because when the Bolt was announced, we heard some talk about how this was designed for sharing ultimately. Is that the kind of thing that we're seeing actually pushing forward these car manufacturers a little bit more?
Yeah, honestly, drivers love the car. Like, as soon as we make one available, it gets snapped up. And we've asked them, like, what do you like about the car? And the common response we get, it's small on the outside, really roomy on the inside. It seats 5 passengers, has ample luggage space. So it fits the need pretty well. We do get a lot of feedback on opportunities for further enhancement that we'll be looking at from a product development perspective.
Part of that has to be just kind of the newness of the car, too. A lot of people haven't had the experience of driving an EV. So do you think that's also helping to drive some of this excitement and the extra utilization there? Absolutely.
In fact, drivers have approached us with, why don't you come up with a referral program to incentivize us to drive sales? Because they see quite a few riders giving them feedback like, hey, what car is this? It's really nice. And when the driver tells them it's all electric, they feel even better about contributing to the solution. So it's, again, drivers love it for the novelty factor, as well as the practicality, as well as the lower operating costs and downtime. So it's working out pretty well.
David, from a day-to-day maintenance perspective of these cars, are there any other advantages to EVs, talking about things like, are they easier to clean, are they easier to maintain, are they easier to manage than an internal combustion car?
Yeah, we mentioned the word active fleet management. I think, if you can combine the charging networks that Peter talked about with BMW, you're still going to need to do the care and feeding and movement of vehicles and the washing. So, obviously at Mannheim, our wholesale auto auctions, we touch about 11 million cars a year. We're now taking some of those services outside the gates. A lot of the stuff that people don't think is very sexy is actually a huge enabler to what's going to enable these shared fleets. The great thing about the EVs in the future, and it's happening already, is they can almost be always on. And a word you're going to hear often is utilization. Really, the economics of these sharing models is really tough. It's really hard to make the numbers work. The key is going to be getting utilization up, which is with the multi-platform. And the second is having a really efficient means to wash them. The experience, when you think about certainly a AV fleet, wash them, move them, maintenance and service on a regular basis. So we're getting into that business in a big way, and we think that in addition to the software and the right vehicle, is really the third pillar of these shared fleets and certainly EV fleet.
And from a utilization standpoint, longer term, are we expecting these cars to be more reliable than internal combustion cars, or is it still a little too early to tell?
It's still early days. We've deployed these in the last 6 months. So far, the results have been great in terms of uptime and utilization, but there's a lot of learning on that path.
But in theory, the fewer moving parts, fewer things to worry about. As we've mentioned before, no oil changes, things like that. It should be better. And ultimately, I think one of the big challenges and one of the concerns that people have when they ask me, should I buy an EV, is how long is the battery pack going to last for? But ultimately, we're talking, short trips and short drives, that kind of thing. It's not so much of a concern here. So I think the expectation, at least, is that these EV cars will be better suited to higher utilization rates. Is that right?
That's right. Theoretically, that's absolutely right.
Yeah, go ahead.
A Tesla Model 3 has 6,000 parts. I think that's a small fraction of how many parts a general car has, right? Mm-hmm. And I think this is a general characteristic of more and more EVs where for sharing, they're particularly well suited. To add on to David's answer on why, EVs are particularly important to autonomous, and this third pillar around services and active fleet management, right? Here's something non-obvious. If you had a magic wand and you could wave it and turn, say, all of Uber's cars autonomous, Uber would actually shut down, at least temporarily. And the reason is because every single one of the Uber drivers that cleans, fuels, and maintains or charges a car today, they're not going to be there, right? So someone like Mannheim, or Car or someone else has to have this massive workforce that's available internationally that is routed, managed efficiently, right? And so I think it's really critical, particularly for EV fleets, that these ecosystem services emerge, which is one of the reasons why, at Ridecell we have focused a lot on not just partnering but integrating with these ecosystem partners, because utilization is really the key, right? It's a little bit self-serving. It's actually quite easy if you're a ride-sharing or car-sharing platform operator to get a large company to launch a car-sharing or ride-sharing service, right? The market is practically forcing them to do that. That's the easy part. The hard part is, can you get them to 20% utilization, right? And I think that's what we focus on. So I think for all of those reasons, I think we think EVs and the ecosystem of services around them are critical.
That's really an interesting point. Everything beyond just actually driving the car. How do you expect that to come up? Do you expect individual companies in individual locations coming up to provide facilities like cleaning and servicing, or do you think that will ultimately be built on top of services like Uber, something that they'll need to invest in?
Yeah, I doubt that it'll be. I think very few companies have the wherewithal, or really even want on the ride-sharing side or even the autonomous side, to build and own these services. These are very hard things, and there are certainly some startups trying these in a small number of cities, but the pace at which shared and autonomous mobility needs to grow, just look at the number of cities Maven and Reach now have launched, right? It's already more than a dozen in the last year. You really need someone at Mannheim scale, someone at the scale of a large fleet management organization to pivot and provide these services. And I was talking to one of the CFOs of a very large OEM, and they actually cannot launch in cities right now because the services that Mannheim offers don't exist today, right? So I actually think that it has to be the larger players that are doing this in some other context, as Mannheim does for auctions, and are pivoting and providing these now to the mobility operators.
To piggyback off of that, I think that the fact that things are moving towards electric is going to dictate a lot of what people are going to do in terms of launch. And I think the infrastructure that's in place is obviously going to impact. I think that the companies that are servicing these cars, that are cleaning these cars, are obviously going to impact. But we keep talking about services that are currently in operation. But I think that, maybe not the best for Maven, but I'm thinking it's going to help everyone. There's going to be more of these services that are coming. And you have to expect that. And the fact that electric cars will become more and more prevalent, yes, they'll become more prevalent probably as a part of a hybrid fleet, more often than not. But the fact that they're going to become prevalent is probably going to impact the type of service that they launch. Whether companies decide to go with a round-trip car share, whether they decide to go with a ride-hailing service, whether they go with a one-way where you park the car but you need to park it at a station. I mean, there's some things that we do in our software where there are certain things that you can dictate and certain conditions that you can dictate where the car needs to be plugged in order for a user to end their trip. And that's very, very important to some of the cities where we're operating, or where some of our clients are operating. So it will dictate outright the number of clients that go into each different modes of shared mobility in the future, for sure.
And that point-to-point car sharing really does add some extra complexities we're talking about EVs, because as you mentioned, if you need to plug in at the end of your trip, well, then you need obviously to have a charger at the place that you want to go to. And right now, that's certainly not the case.
Yeah, and that ties into what I was talking about earlier about the charging infrastructure that needs to be in place. That will also dictate the type of service that you're going to launch. If there's a service where you can build up from the ground up your own infrastructure and it's actually cost effective to do so, you might decide to go with a point-to-point and you're just going to leave the car and plug that vehicle in. And we're seeing that happen, mostly in Europe. But there's also round-trip car share that offers this sort of thing. When you're talking about things like ride-hailing and certain things like free-floating car share where the cars are just parked on the street, obviously that brings different complication when you're talking about range, but you have to keep in mind that for these types of car share or ride-hail, the typical ride is typically a little bit shorter, right? So for the average services that we have, and we have 14 free-floating cities around the world, and the average ride is between 18 to 22 minutes. So we're not seeing these trips really go for 4 days, and if there are 4 days, they'll figure out a place to park somewhere else where there's a charger.
Akshay, you've got Bolts in the fleet now. Can you give us some idea of average length of trip, and ultimately is the maximum range 230 some miles? Is that proving to be a problem at this point, or ultimately are the trips short enough that that's not really an issue yet?
Yeah, honestly, when we first deployed the Bolts, we were very concerned about range anxiety and how does it fit into the driver's day-to-day routine, because these guys are driving to earn, right? They want to make sure they're maximizing every minute on the road. What's been fascinating is the drivers have kind of figured it out. So 238 miles is sufficient range for, they're driving about 120 miles a day, in ride sharing. And they also supplement that with some kind of delivery during the lunch hour or so. But when talking to drivers, what they tend to do is they plan their day around the downtime. So, they can take that 1 hour to have lunch, to go take a break, and charge at a Whole Foods or whatever it takes. So we include Eevee Go charging cards along with the car that provides them access to that infrastructure, which is actually working out pretty well for them.
So you're still expecting the consumer, though, at this point to charge their car versus the car kind of taking care of itself, or somebody in the fleet taking care of it for them?
I mean, eventually, that's the power of an electric car, that you don't need the same manpower to gas and, maintain it. But for now, yes, we are depending heavily on the rideshare renters to go and charge the cars.
And David, how much do you think autonomy will help this going forward? I mean, obviously, if the car can drive itself to charge itself, presumably that makes things a little bit easier, right?
You took the words right out of my mouth. I think there's going to be before AV and after AV, and I think we still got a long way to go. But certainly, with true autonomy, then the hub and spoke model where you'd see a Mannheim auction and then you might see a dealer location be that hub and spoke, and you'd actually see the maintenance and service and recharging pretty seamless when you look at the bell curve of usage. I mean, just commuter hours is the peaks, and you've got a lot of opportunity to charge, in between. So I think once we hit true autonomy, which, again, I'm surprised it hasn't been asked. It's somewhere soon.
Yeah.
I think the inflection point really dramatically goes up, and Eevee is the way to go. So yeah, I do think there's a big difference. In the interim, you're going to see a lot more like the Whole Foods corporate campuses. We're seeing a huge spike in. And then you're going to see a lot of mobile delivery of these services, whether it's washing, maintenance, and service, to even tires getting done on a mobile basis.
All right, guys, I warned you that would go quick, and we're about out of time, but I do want to bring up the poll results before we go to see what your thoughts were in terms of the implications. And wow, pretty significant there. Looks like 77% of people think that EVs will help. Do you all agree? Seeing nods, agree? Yes, I hope so, because you're all kind of pretty closely tied to this. All right, guys, thanks very much for the discussion, and thanks everybody for attending, and we'll move on to the next. Thanks
Thank you.
guys. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.